A better route. Chapter 87. Naruto's training on Mount Myaboku had begun much slower than he wanted it to. Apparently, it turned out that you could only go into sage mode if your physical and spiritual chakra was balanced precisely with your nature chakra, and with the way things were, Naruto needed to get more control over his affinity before the toads would even let him even attempt to enter sage mode. Despite his annoyance of why, the toads had given him a pretty good reason of what the risks held. Pa told him during the first time he brought it up, "Listen, Naruto boy, if you get too much of your nature chakra in your system, then you're gonna turn into a toad, and that could eventually escalate quickly into a statue." Naruto looked around him at all the toad statues around mountain. So these are different people who failed when they tried to use sage mode? Pa nodded, "Yup, but at least they make nice decorations." Gamakichi piped in, "It's like chocolate swirl ice cream, too much chocolate and it ruins the whole batch." Naruto decided to ask another question, about how far do I need to get with my control before I can attempt for sage mode? Pa really wanted to make sure this kid was ready, so he said, "Once you can add your element to your Rasengan, then you start going for sage mode." Naruto really didn't want to have to wait that long, but at least he'd been intending to finish that anyways. He just had one last thing to ask, "You guys got a waterfall around here?" Kakashi groaned, "Why do I have to learn a whole new taijutsu style?" Dokibi had just told Boy that he refused to start teaching him about sage mode, until he learned to fight in the snake style, because, if you're going to use sage mode then you're going to use our taijutsu style as well. Besides, it works better with our sage mode than your original style. Kakashi sighed, "I guess that's fair. So who's the lucky one that gonna be the one to teach it to me?" Dokibi had carefully pondered about it. "Usually I'd ask Manda, but frankly I don't trust him around you." "Who's your summon again?" At that, Kakashi said with some pride, "That would be Kakumiai." Dokibi was clearly self-debating his options. "He can be a bit of a goof-off at times, but I think he should be able to teach it to you well enough. I'm guessing that's okay with you." Kakashi was ecstatic to be hearing this. "Sure. Is it really possible for a snake to teach it to a human?" Dokibi nodded, "Oh yes, it should be relatively easy for him to teach it to, especially if you two work well together. Now go start training with him and be back here in about 7 hours." Kakashi did not want to go and practice taijutsu for that long, but you didn't want to piss off Dokibi, and as the saying goes, a guy's got to do what guys got to do. Once the head sage was done talking with Kakashi, he immediately left to go and find his summon animal. Mito had been busy admiring the marble pillar around the temple when suddenly the pleasant voice of T-Mei caught her attention. "Lady Mito, there's a little something Sanagu wished for me to tell you about before you began your training." Mito was curious if it was something relevant with her training. "All right, what is it?" T-Mei said in an almost whisper voice, "Sanagu doesn't think that the medic style of taijutsu would be suited to your sage mode, so she's suggesting you start learning a second one right away." Mito could see some truth to that. After all, medical style taijutsu was a very defensive way to fight, and when one thought about it, that didn't fit well with sage mode. Still, she wasn't sure what kind of taijutsu style she should switch to. "Do the slugs have any specific kind of taijutsu I could learn that they would recommend?" T-Mei shook her head, "No, we do not. We've got no limbs to fight with like the toads have, nor have the speed like the snakes do. It's why we're used more for reconnaissance than fighting." Mito wasn't really sure what to think of that. "Well then, what kind of taijutsu style should I use?" Tsunade had been listening to the entire conversation and decided to suggest, "What if we had Guy come up and examine which style would be best suited for you? If anyone could think of taijutsu style for you, it's gonna be him." Mito frowned a little bit. She'd always had a slight fear of Guy. While he was, despite the fact, she knew he recognized as the greatest taijutsu specialist in the entire shinobi world. However, her mother was indeed right. Guy was better than anyone at picking out a good taijutsu style for someone. It really was a no-brainer. I guess it's the best move I have right now and the only other option I've got. Can you just promise me one thing? Tsunade raised an eyebrow. What would that be? Mito had a lot of fear in her eyes. Promise me that you won't let him have me wear one of those green spandex suit. I'm afraid I would receive nightmares for a while if I did. Sai found himself very confused at the moment. Danzo had given him a very specific location to go to and retrieve some documents that had certain mark on them, but when he arrived it was just an empty clearing with some trees in it. Despite its appearance, he couldn't help but notice something strange about one of the trees. He took notice that there was a small snake-shaped imprint left on the base of a tree at the center of the clearing. That's when Sai remembered something he found out about when he'd researched his father. Orochimaru had a few labs that only he and a select few could get into, which were marked with a small snake like this one. The imprint was actually a seal that could open the lab when activated, but the only way to activate it was to swipe it with some blood. The only concern was it had to be of the few people Orochimaru had selected. One of the people selected was Sai's father. However, if a person had similar DNA it would still more than likely work. Sai could see the real reason Danzo had sent him out here. He wanted whatever documents Orochimaru had left in the base about his experiments and knew that with Sai's skills and heritage, he might be able to get in. It made him sick to his stomach to even do this, but he hadn't forgotten what was at stake here, so he bit his thumb to draw blood nonetheless. After wiping his blood on the seal, Sai could feel something in tree moving. A click was heard and some kind of door opened in the tree in front of Sai. The very first thing Sai noticed was the smell that was released when the door opened. It was actually so rancid that Sai had to get out some nose plugs just to keep himself from puking. There was an iron ladder leading down to lab. Sai took a deep breath before climbing down it, for he was about to come face to face with his father's work. The usually quiet hills of Mount Myaboku were now echoing with the frustrated screams of everyone's favorite knucklehead ninja. Naruto had been trying to apply the use of his wind chakra to split the waterfall Pennsylvania had sent him to for the past 2 days and had made a minuscule amount of progress. It was such a difficult task to complete because there were so many separate things you had to focus on to make sure that it worked. The end goal of the exercise was for Naruto to be able to split the waterfall in the middle with his wind chakra, and after completing that he would, then, try adding his element to the Rasengan. However, there were 3 major things you had to do in order to make sure that it worked. First, you needed to apply exactly the right amount of chakra to be used to split the waterfall. If you used too much, the wind would just make the waterfall explode. However, if you used too little then the waterfall wouldn't do anything at all, mainly just a splash. It was similar to sage training in the sense that an absolute balance was to be achieved for it to be perfect. Second, you had to make sure that waterfall split across the middle perfectly straight. That one wasn't hard to explain, but it wasn't easy to do either. Finally, you had to be able to maintain the split at an interval for at least 30 seconds or it didn't count. While Naruto had enough chakra to do this, the amount of focus it took was just gnawing at him. All in all, it equaled one hell of a challenging task and Naruto to complete because he was really getting irritated of this. Finally Hinata, who had been watching him for about an hour, came up to him. "Come on Naruto-kun, why don't you take a break, you've been at it for quite some time." Naruto sighed, "Why in the hell can't I do this? I watched Asuma-sensei do this once, but from the looks of it, he made it look like nothing." Hinata thought back to when Asuma had shown them the exercise back to when they first became genin. While it was true, he did make seem that it didn't require much effort, appearances were usually deceiving, then again he also had much less chakra than Naruto did. Then suddenly, Hinata came with an idea on how to fix this problem. "How about tomorrow you try it again and I watch you with my Byakugan and see if I can figure out what's wrong?" Naruto thought that sounded like a pretty bright idea. "That'd be great Hinata-chan, thanks a million. So what do they have to eat up here?" Hinata had almost forgotten to tell him the surprise she's been waiting to reveal to him. I finally convinced Ma to try and make you some ramen. Naruto grabbed his girlfriend and spun her around. I love this woman. There are several things in this world that frighten people, which can range from spiders to heights, so mainly, everybody's got something to be afraid of. However, nothing had ever scared Sai so much as going through and being aware of his father's work. The entire place was filthy and looked like anyone had entered in years, which by what it looked like, was just the situation here. It looked like whoever was here last, left quickly and in a rush because several of the experiments were still strapped to the table. Sai could only hope they had already been dead when this place was abandoned. Sai wasn't sure where exactly these documents would be located, which meant he was more than likely going to have to start going through this place to go searching for them. He noticed one room was much bigger than the others and figured that would be a good place to start first. When he walked in, Sai saw that instead of the only one of 2 tables he'd seen before, there were actually 5 tables in this room. What was even stranger is that these 5 tables seemed like they'd been used much more recently. Maybe not in the past year or 2, but it definitely hadn't been 16 years since they'd been last used though. Another thing he observed was the room was a lot cleaner than the others were. Sai looked around the room and could see there were a few filing cabinets around the room. Figuring he must be getting close to whatever it was that Danzo was looking for, Sai opened some of them and took a look inside. He found plenty of papers and most of them had the mark he was looking for, but there was something very wrong about them. Most of them were dated just over 6 years ago, not 16 like they should have been. Sai started to read a few of them and couldn't understand what exactly most of it meant, but of the materials listed, they seemed to be talking about spider silk, flutes, and bones. None of this made any sense to Sai. Why on earth would Orochimaru use an old base and why did he leave the documents here as well? Despite these unwavering questions, that didn't matter right now, he had to bring these documents to Danzo. Maybe then he'd find out what all of this meant.